Story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Though you are far away, wonderful story of love, still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, e'en from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love, 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 wonderful story of love. Jesus provides a rest, wonderful story of love, for all the pure and blessed. Rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us.
Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2, start around verse 14. And this will serve as a foundation for our study this morning. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things. Down in verse 17 of the same context, therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. That was interesting. Jesus, according to these verses, shares our nature. He was made like us, it says, in every respect. And this includes the spectrum of human emotions that we experience in life. Emotions sometimes are thought of by folks as being a bad thing. Emotions are not bad. Being driven by emotions alone, what sometimes is referred to as emotionalism, without any application of self-control, without the use of the reason that God gave us, that's not good, but emotions themselves are not bad. And we must not allow ourselves to become confused about this. And the reason I say that is because for a lot of people, when they see folks that are driven by their emotions, that are just uncontrolled and that are emotionalistic, the response to that is to swing to the complete opposite end of the spectrum and to try to exist and function and act without emotion at all. There was a whole philosophy among the Greeks that believed that you needed to control your emotions and be purely rational. And that philosophy got legs and a personality and a character in Star Trek, in the character of Spock, who was completely logical, completely rational, and had no emotion at all. And then in the reboot to Star Trek, The Next Generation, it was an android character named Data, who represented the same kind of thing. This is an actual, real struggle that people have. We need to not be confused and not think that emotions are bad, not think that feeling something means that you're not thinking, not think that because you do something with emotions means that you're not doing it rationally or purposefully or because of it being a proper thing, but in fact, you think that you're just responding. No, that's not what it means. And we know that because Jesus was made like us in all things. And when he lived on this earth, you know what he did? He felt emotions. He used emotions. He expressed emotions. And it is seen clearly in his life. We want to look at a few passages. Turn to the Gospel of John. And this is where we'll get started. John chapter 11. And we want to just look at verses 33 through 35. This is the occasion where Mary and Martha's brother Lazarus has died, and Jesus was in another place, and they've called for him, and he's traveled there, and he's dead. And he's been dead 4 days at this point, interestingly. And it says in verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping, and that's speaking about Mary. Mary had come out to meet him, and she was weeping at the loss of her brother. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. And verse 35 says, Jesus wept. Now I want you to understand that this is an exercise of empathy and compassion for other people. When Jesus saw people weeping, he cried with them. Now we need to understand something. Jesus was about to exercise his authority over death and raise Lazarus from the dead. He was going to say, Lazarus, come forth. Lazarus is going to get up and walk out. He knew that. He knew he had the power. He knew what he was about to do. He knew that all that was going to... He was weeping here because he felt their pain and was experiencing their loss with them. This is an emotional response to a situation. And we see him plainly. We see him plainly having such a response. Over in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19, looking at verse 41 through 44. He's outside of the city of Jerusalem. This is getting close to the end of his time on earth, and he knows that the people of Jerusalem have rejected his teaching. And he says, when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they're hidden from your eyes. For days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you because you did not know the time of your visitation. He understood these people. He understood their circumstances. He understood what was going to happen to them in a relatively short period of time. He understood that they were completely blind to it all, and that they were not listening, and they were not changing, and that their judgment was going to come, and that city was going to be utterly destroyed. And he sat outside of that city and wept over the condition of the people of that city, and they weren't even weeping for themselves. So he was able to feel emotion and grief for other people's circumstances, whether they appreciated those circumstances or not. And it moved him, and he felt it, and he acted upon it, and he cried real tears and felt real grief and pain. And then on the other side of the spectrum, he understood love and joy. Back in the Gospel of John in chapter 15, verses 10 and 11, the scripture says this: if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandment and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. And so he lived in this world, and he understood divine love, and he understood obedience, and he understood how important it was to walk in fellowship with God, and he did it, and he experienced it, and he felt the joy that arises from being in that kind of fellowship with God. And this is what he says to them. He said, look, I've talked to you, I've taught you the things that I've spoken to you, so that my joy, the joy that I experience in life, the joy that I feel, that joy can be in you, and that your joy can be full. So not only did he feel and understand divine love and joy, he experienced it. He wants us to experience it, and he wants us to experience it fully. He doesn't want it to be truncated or limited or set aside, for sure. He felt frustration and anger. You ever felt frustration and anger? Well, so did the Lord. And he responded in frustration and anger. Look at John chapter 2, verses 13 through 17 or so with me. John chapter 2, starting at verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And so there's this big feast, and it's that time, and everybody's going to Jerusalem, and Jesus goes up to Jerusalem, and in the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And so he walks in, and he sees this scene, and there's people setting up, and they're selling animals for sacrifice is what they're doing, and they're taking advantage of people. They're charging them apparently way more than they should have been. And they're doing this in a way where they kind of do it where, okay, you don't need to carry your animals all the way from home. We'll sell them when you get here. And then they put it, and he sees this. And the money changers, you're coming in from over here and you've got this kind of money. Well, you got to have temple money. And so I'll exchange your money so you can use it here at the temple. But apparently the exchange rates were not very honorable. And so he walks in, and that's what he sees going on in the temple of God. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold pigeons, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade. And his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. He felt frustration and anger and zeal, passion. He was passionate about what the people of God did and how they did it, and particularly how they behaved in the temple of God, engaging in the worship of God, supposedly or supposed to be engaging in the work. Unfortunately, they had turned it into a house of trade. They were just trying to make money. And so he goes around turning over tables, and he makes a whip, and he drives people out and says, just get out of here. You can see in this description the frustration that he had and how it affected his behavior and his speech and his conduct. He wasn't doing anything wrong. We know from Hebrews, Jesus never once sinned. We know from the Gospels that no guile was found in his mouth. In his speech and conduct, he was above board all the time, and he walked in righteousness, and he felt frustration and anger and zeal and expressed it openly. He felt frustration with other people and with the effort that they put in to develop themselves spiritually and to serve. Look with me in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 17. Chapter 17, we're going to look at verses 14 through 17 of this chapter. When they came to the crowd, a man came up to him, kneeling before him, and said, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he's an epileptic and he suffers terribly. For he often falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him. Now, Jesus had already given them some authority over some of these things, already sent them out once to exercise that authority. And they'd come back all excited about some of the things that they had done. And here's this guy who had gone to them for help, and they couldn't help, and he comes back and he goes to the Lord and he says, he literally throws himself at his feet and says, can you help me? This is a terrible affliction. And I brought him to your disciples, and your disciples could not heal him. And listen to Jesus' answer. "O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you?" He is not talking about this man or his son. He's talking about his disciples. How long am I to bear with you? In other words, how long do I have to carry you along? Bring him here to me. He was frustrated. Frustrated with the fact that these disciples that he was working, that he was teaching with, that he had granted authority to, that they had not yet had the kind of faith that was necessary for them to push forward and do what they ought to have done. And he expressed that frustration. He had compassion for other people's ignorance and helplessness in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 36. That's clearly expressed. They didn't know, and they should have known, and they didn't have anyone helping them, and they couldn't do it alone, and he was frustrated by that, and he felt compassion. In Luke chapter 7 and verse 9, there's a man that comes to him and shows a measure of faith that the text says that he marveled over. He marveled over this man's faith, it says. That's an emotional response. That is looking at someone else and looking at a demonstration of faith in their life and going, that is absolutely astounding. He felt this sense of wonder about how this person could have such great faith. When, as we read just a moment ago, there were people that were right there with him every day. That he asked them, "Oh, ye of little faith, how long? How long am I going to have to wait?" Jesus experienced life that way, and he didn't stop his emotions, and he didn't not take emotions, and he didn't say, "Oh, emotions are bad." He felt them, he experienced them, he expressed them. And I would suggest to you that knowing that Jesus experienced and embraced and expressed his emotions, as disciples of Jesus, we probably should feel as well. Unfortunately, I fear that far too often we try to block that off. We try to be clinical in our faith. We take decently and orderly to the point that it more accurately can be described as dead, as lifeless. And we need to be careful about that. Service involves our heart, not just our minds and not just our bodies. Look in Mark chapter 12 with me. Mark chapter 12, start reading in verse 29 with me. One of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that, he answered them well. And they asked him, "Which commandment is the most important of all?" And Jesus said, "The most important is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all of your soul, and with all of your mind, and with all of your strength." Now, he's dealing there with body. He's dealing there with an intellect. And he's dealing there first with the heart of man. What's the most important commandment? He says, loving God is the most important commandment. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. It begins in your heart and moves through your mind and your body and strength and all that you are. Service starts in our heart. And service that doesn't come from our heart is not service at all. We have to be passionate in our service. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 11, if you'll turn over there with me quickly. Do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Don't be slow about passion. That's what the word fervent means. Zeal. Don't be slow about your zeal, but instead be passionate as you serve the Lord. When people are passionate about stuff, you can see it. And I can tell in about 3.5 seconds when I start talking about certain things that are of interest to me and that I'm passionate about, if the person I'm talking to shares that passion. We have to be passionate about our service to God. That engages our spirit, our emotions, how we feel. We have to be passionate as we teach. Look in the book of Acts quickly with me, Acts chapter 18 and verse 25. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. This is a description of Apollos, but I want you to see that as Apollos was teaching, and it's already told us that he was an eloquent man, that he was knowledgeable about the scriptures. But more than that, when he began to teach, he did it passionately, fervently. And they had a sense of that. There has to be some kind of an emotional response. We're not computers. We're not machines. We're not robots. We weren't built that way. He could have built us that way if that's what he wanted. Or he could have exemplified that kind of a life when he lived here on the earth if that's what he wanted. But instead, he exemplified a fervent, passionate life. What about our prayers? James chapter 5:16, a passage we're all familiar with. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. Fervent. There's that word again, passion. It's not just saying words. It's speaking from your hearts to a God that you love and you depend upon, about things that you care about and are concerned about and are desperate over, and that comes out and arises from our speech. When we sing Ephesians 5:19 and Colossians 3:16, I'm going to just trust that most of the people in the room are familiar with those passages. If you're not, write them down, look them up. What it says is to sing and make melody in your heart. You ever thought about what that means? What exactly does it mean to make melody with our heart? Well, it means that we should emotionally coordinate with the words of the psalm, the hymn, or the song that we're singing. That it's not just replicating words. It's not even just making a melody with sound. It is coordinating our heart to what we're singing. It is harmonizing our heart to these songs. We haven't sung and made melody in our hearts unto the Lord if we don't engage our whole being. And by the way, I don't care whether you sing in tune or actually that's not true. I do care. But it doesn't matter in your worship to God whether you sing in tune or not. It doesn't matter if you miss a melody. I don't even think it matters all that much if you accidentally say the wrong word, which sometimes happens with me, and sometimes I know it happens sometimes with the song leaders because I'm reading it right behind them and they say something different than what's written on the screen. Most of that's because we've learned some of these hymns from other versions and we sing what we know instead of what's on the page. But listen, I'm telling you right now, you can sing all day long, you can sing 10,000 words, and if you do it without your heart, you haven't praised God not one moment. People sing hundreds of songs every week that offer no praise to God. In order to worship God and to teach and admonish one another as we do so, which is the whole purpose of our singing in the first place. In order for that to happen, we got to make melody here in our hearts, in the inner man, in that part of us that our emotions lie in. That has to be coordinated with what we are doing. And it doesn't mean that we allow ourselves to become lost in our emotions. It doesn't mean that we allow ourselves to act uncontrollable. I tell you, if you fall out on the ground and start rolling around and yelling and screaming, somebody's going to ask you to take your seat and be quiet. That's disorderly. But it's just as disorderly to sit there and not feel anything. Bad things happen when people allow their emotions to rule the day. And in the 19th chapter of the book of Acts, starting in I'm going to start reading in verse 29 if you want to read along with me. So the city was filled with confusion. They rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions. So Paul is out and he's been traveling, he's been preaching, he's got these companions with him, and the people hear the preaching and the people are reacting to the preaching. Paul wished to go in among the crowd, but the disciples would not let him, and even some of Aristarchus, who were friends of his, sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. Some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. I want you to understand, there's just this craziness that has arisen in this crowd, and they didn't even know why they were there anymore. And Alexander has to come in the next few verses and kind of quiet everything down and bring things back under control. That's not good. When I'm not using my brain and I'm not engaged and I don't know what I'm doing, I'm just reacting, that's not good. That's where mobs come from. That's where rioting arises from. That's where all of this kind of stuff that we see on the news when people are burning down buildings and cars and stuff. That's where it comes from. That's not healthy. But listen, it's also not healthy to not feel and to not empathize and to not care and to not concern and to not love and to not act from that place. We must feel what we do. We must feel what we say. We must feel what we pray. We must feel what we sing. We cannot be cold. We cannot be indifferent. We cannot be unfeeling. We cannot be callous. And we certainly can't do it in our service to God. Mark chapter 7 in verse 6, Jesus says this, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites." Now I'm going to stop here for a moment. and let you know that the word hypocrite is a transliterated word. They took a Greek word and just made an American word out of it. It is essentially a thespian, an actor, is what a hypocrite was. And so he's talking about people that he calls actors, play acting. You're pretending. Well, as I prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. See, that's what it is when our songs don't have our heart behind them, when our prayers don't have our heart behind them, when our teaching doesn't have our heart behind it, when we don't feel the zeal and the passion and the love for God and the zeal for the worship of praise of God, when we're just there doing it because it's what we're supposed to do. Jesus says, you're just play acting. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me. It's not good. Cardia. That's the word that's translated heart there. It's regarded as the seat of feeling, of impulse, of affection, of desire, of the intellect, of the inner and mental frame. It's the same thing as the inner man. It is that non-material part of us that's created in the image of God. That's where it begins, and that has to be engaged. We need to be certain that our hearts are near to God, that our love for God is fervent, that we are zealous for good works. Not just engaging good works, but zealous for good works, wanting to do it, desiring, burning in our desire. That our hearts are behind our praise, that our hearts are put into our prayers, that we actually open up ourselves and bear ourselves before God and say, this is what I feel, and this is how I am, and this is what I truly desire. And the part that engages the intellect is making sure that this is what I truly desire part lines up with the will of God. I think maybe the best place to close on this is something that we read in the Gospel of Mark just a couple of weeks ago, when a man came before him and he said that this could only be done when one believes, and he said, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. That was fervent. That was engaged. That was honest. That was real. That was not play acting. I do believe. I want to believe even more. I do pursue you. I want to pursue more. My son-in-law asked me a couple of weeks ago a question, interesting question. I don't know if I'm going to get the question exactly right, but it was something along the lines of, if you had the opportunity to ask God a question and you weren't going to get in trouble for doing it, what would you ask? And I said, I would ask him what I'm missing. What do I not understand properly? What am I not doing right? Because I don't want to be wrong. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. That's the kind of genuine, heart-engaged service that God is looking for. I'm going to make a promise to you. This isn't a good promise. It's just the way it is. You will make mistakes. So if you are one of those people like me that think that it's only good enough when I do it perfectly, you're going to disappoint yourself. You will make mistakes. Be honest about it. Strive. Be fervent. Be serious. And I mean serious not in demeanor, but in purpose. About actually engaging in a relationship and fellowship with God. And watch what God will do. See how He can transform you. See how His Word will change the way you look at the world. But you can't go at it halfway. Lesson's yours for you to consider. I hope I've said something stimulating to you. I know that the lesson has not been designed, I have no idea there it is, to instruct on the ways.
I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun it shall